Okay, so sometime back I actually asked for your suggestions in terms of games that I should be checking out on the Steam Deck, and periodically you just tend to drop a lot of suggestions in the comments, and every time you do that, I keep a gigantic list of every game that gets recommended so that I can go back periodically and see if, one, maybe it's already in my library, and two, if it's not, if I can find it on sale, then I'll go ahead and pick it up and check it out. And that's what today's video is all about, is I actually picked up a few, and actually had a couple of these games already in my library that you suggested, and I just tried them out for the first time. So, with all that being said, here are 5 different titles that, again, either already existed in my library, or I just picked up because you told me to buy it, and here's what I thought of those games. And the first one is Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, which was recommended by Stuart Leckie. So Enslaved: Odyssey to the West is a game that I remember seeing on store shelves, and I saw it over and over again, and for whatever reason I just always glossed over it. I would imagine it's because at launch I really wasn't that excited about it, and then later on it dropped in price significantly, and I was like, well, if it's that cheap, then it's probably not a great game. And I really shouldn't have done that, because even after just like 20 minutes of playing Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, I was like, this is definitely the kind of game that I enjoy. Set 150 years after a global war and a post-apocalypse, you'll take on the role of Monkey, a prisoner on a ship that is very much in the process of crashing before the adventure kicks off proper with somebody that you meet named Trip. You'll engage in a variety of platforming, puzzles, and combat that is heavily focused on a bow staff, and it really just wastes no time getting you acclimated to its various game flavors before the adventure kicks off. Now, I don't know if I would say it's the absolute smoothest combat that I've ever seen in a third-person action puzzle platformer, but it feels pretty great, and it starts laying out how to execute combos, charge attacks, blocks, and dodges very quickly. I also really like that you have a shield that just sort of automatically does its thing as you're getting pinged with projectiles while you close the gap. And the gameplay just felt really great, so much so that it actually made me stop and say, okay, maybe I need to re-examine my tendency to just sort of gloss over games based purely on the cover. And visually, I really love the aesthetic as well, because typically in post-apocalypse games it tends to default to this grungy, sort of dirty look, but Odyssey to the West is flat out lush in its environments, and I really like how vivid everything appears. There's just like rich green overgrowth everywhere, wildlife, and it's a whole lot of fun just running around its environments, especially when your range of movement is just so refined. And considering this is a game that came out in 2010, it immediately plays like a dream on the deck without any modification and a solid 60 FPS, and the controls are good to go immediately. I'm not sure how much I'll like Monkey and Trip just yet, but initially I have to say the voice performances are totally solid, and I'm really curious to see where the story goes. So, Stuart, thanks again for cluing me into a game that I just completely and unfairly dismissed for a very long time. But now let's look at a game that is equally lush, however it is a 2D game and it is set in a pre-apocalypse rather than a post-apocalypse, and that is Yoku's Island Express, which was recommended to me by Hunter Short. And I believe that Hunter recommended this based on a video that I did where I showcased Demon's Tilt, which is an occult pinball game. Yoku's Island is a pinball Metroidvania, and right from the jump it has this incredibly playful atmosphere and presentation. You play as a dung beetle who, after washing up on the island, takes over postmaster duties from a postadactyl, I think is what he's called. But despite your humble beginnings, your adventure will actually lead you to having to save the island itself from a forthcoming threat. Now, even though Hunter suggested that I play this, the truth was I already had this game for the Switch, but when I found out it was on sale, I figured why not snatch it up for the deck as well, considering it's a very pretty game, and I just assumed it would load faster and perform better on the deck overall, so why not have my first experience there? It's playful and whimsical, and I gotta say, I just love games like this. And curiously, even though it's effectively a 2D platformer, you don't have a jump button to move Yoku around, so you'll have to rely on bumpers for most of the work anytime you have to go vertical. The controls are simple and gradually unlock more interesting traversal mechanics as you continue to collect fruit and clear gates to unlock more and more of an ever-increasing map. Along the way, you'll meet colorful characters who need you to do quests for them, and the whole thing is just sort of sickeningly adorable. One of the first things you unlock is Yoku's postal horn, which I actually don't think it's the official postal horn that I got yet, but rather it's just like a birthday horn sort of noisemaker, and it was just so funny I could not help but spam it over and over. Now, as far as the actual pinball mechanics go, they're really satisfying with this sort of thock sound every time you bounce around. And it's sort of like you're just traveling from one pocket of pinball action to the next, but with much less stress than an actual pinball machine if you were just like aggressively seeking a high score or something. Now, I did find it a little bit annoying after I'd already fulfilled an objective in one of these little pinball pockets to try to get back out, but honestly that's a pretty minor inconvenience at worst. Yoku runs at a perfect 60 as a 2.5D-ish sort of game, and you can easily get 5 or 6 hours of playtime out of it. Controls work just fine without any need for customization in my time with it, and I'm kind of pumped to see where it goes, not just for the characters I've seen so far and the satisfying open-world pinball mechanics, but also to see what other areas I can explore on what looks like it's going to be a pretty massive map. So, Hunter, if you're watching, thank you again for the suggestion, and I'm looking forward to playing this one more. And while we're on the subject of games that aren't quite so high octane and really are just more relaxed affairs, next up will be a game that a lot of you recommended, although I think Ryan Warland was the first one to suggest it, and that is Dorf Romantic. So Dwarf Romantic reminded me of a game that really I think was like almost like more of a toy than a game really. I think it was called Townscaper, where essentially you get randomly generated titles and you can just slowly flesh out like a world on a grid and lay down tiles for things like fields or streams or railroads or towns. Although I will say it did seem a little bit more complicated than I was expecting for a relaxing game, despite the fact that a lot of people recommended it. It's not that I didn't enjoy my time with it, I did, but I always felt like I was laying down tiles incorrectly, even though I did gradually like watching my town expand and seeing, where the railroads would snake to and, where I could put that next forest piece. Like, it was enjoyable and relaxing, and it was cool that it seems like you unlock new pieces gradually, because I did not have a windmill when I started out, and yet by the end of my time playing it, I had unlocked a windmill to put down in certain locations. And the only thing that I can really knock this for, despite the fact that I did find it relaxing, is it does reward you for placing pieces in a logical way where you're sort of connected to those of the same type. So every time I put one down, if I couldn't find a perfect place for it to fit, I always felt like I was doing sort of badly at the game. But aside from that, as long as I could sort of look past the desire to just make sure every piece is perfectly placed and just appreciate it for what it was, I actually did have a pretty relaxing time just sort of scoping out the environment and seeing what I'd laid down and what I was able to flesh out. The camera controls took a little bit more to get used to than I would have expected, but ultimately it's not a super taxing game. It's a fairly 2D affair, I would say, or 2.5D as well, maybe. But it runs perfectly fine on the deck, and I think I was getting 60, just fine, because again, it's not an overly taxing title or anything like that. And I don't think it's the type of game that you're meant to sit down and marathon necessarily. I think really it is best as maybe a palate cleanser between other titles, but hey, again, maybe I'm just missing something strategic here and I'm just really bad at it. So if you have a lot of experience with Dwarf Romantic and want to drop some tips for me down below, I will definitely read those. But yeah, Ryan, thank you so much for the recommendation and ultimately cluing me into another chill game that I could probably put in another chill games list later on. Next up is a game that was recommended by Michael the Dorian, and I believe he made this recommendation because of my love for Power Wash Simulator, which is honestly one of my favorite games of 2022, and done in a very similar art style would be House Flipper. Now there's another game that I got not too long ago thanks to Humble Choice, and that was Gas Station Simulator, and I sort of got the impression when I started House Flipper that it would be similar to that experience. In House Flipper you'll start off working out of a very tiny office, and really the biggest interactable element there is a laptop. And from that laptop you can take on jobs to, well, do things to fix people's houses, whether that's painting things, or maybe you're going to install some radiators or put a new sink in. And at first I was worried this would be a really complicated game because all those things sound really complicated in real life, because I'm certainly no handyman, but ultimately it's very streamlined whenever you start playing it. So some of the jobs that I took on, like painting a house, requires you to buy gallons of paint, and then you take a roller and interact with the paint bucket, and then when you point the roller at the wall, it sort of gives you these segmented sections where you'll lay down paint. And one of the things I really liked about the gameplay is it seemed like all of this was very, very intuitive. You didn't have to really memorize a lot of complex mechanics, you really just had to remember to go to your tool wheel to figure out what you needed to be interacting with at the time, and a lot of the things like installing or doing repairs was done through not even mini games, but rather just simple button presses that you would hold down to do things like, affix a radiator to a wall, or connect the plumbing for a bathroom sink. And while some people might look at those activities and say, hey, that sounds pretty boring, like stuff that I wouldn't want to do around the house anyways, when applied within the context of a video game, I found it to be a very relaxing, borderline therapeutic experience, not too unlike Power Wash Simulator. Plus, they've gone ahead and layered some light RPG elements on top of it as well. The more you do a certain activity, the more points you can unlock, and those points can be used to do things like, increase your painting speed, or reduce the amount of time it takes to perform certain actions. And all of this is done in service to making money off of completing these jobs, which then allows you to buy more interesting equipment. I think at a certain point I'm probably going to have the ability to increase the size of the office that I work out of, because it's basically a shack at this point. And it all has a very simple, straightforward visual presentation, so if you've played Power Wash Simulator, or probably any of the simulator games honestly, you're probably going to have an idea of what to expect here. I will say it feels a little bit more complex than Power Wash Simulator, which I guess makes sense given the range of repairs and upgrades and things that you can do in the game. But at the same time, it's so simply laid out that I wouldn't say it's intimidating by any stretch of the imagination. And considering I'm kind of a sucker for any kind of simulator game that has you just sort of putting order to chaos, this felt like a game that was right up my alley, so Michael, thanks again for the recommendation. And finally, the last game on this list that was recommended to me was from the Retro Rivals, who are absolutely adorable. You should go check out their channel. I'll be sure to drop a link somewhere up here so you can go check them out as well. But that game was Made of Scare. Set in 1898 at the Scare Hotel on the fictional Scare Island, you'll be playing as Thomas Evans. After getting an invitation from your lady friend Elizabeth to come to the hotel, you will be tasked with uncovering its mysteries, particularly sorting out the strange behavior of Elizabeth's family. The problem being that a cult has taken over. And as you begin exploring the island and the hotel, you will gradually begin to peel back layers of the story through notes and gramophone records that are sort of scattered throughout the environments. In addition to giving you greater context of the situation that you find yourself in, it will also start giving you more and more of the family's history. The whole thing is pretty immediately unsettling, but I like the visuals a lot because not every environment is dour and dingy, and some of them are actually quite beautiful. And mechanically, I would say it feels like any first-person exploration sim in the vein of Outlast, but you can definitely feel the influences of other titles as well, like BioShock or Resident Evil. Now, I wouldn't say it's the scariest game that I've played on the Steam Deck yet, but the fact that it is heavily atmospheric and it doesn't seem like it's relying purely on jump scares is definitely a plus for me. Now, this one did seem to tax the Steam Deck a little bit harder in the graphics department. Like, I don't think technically they're the most demanding graphics that I've ever seen or anything like that, but I did end up scaling back some of the graphical effects, like motion blur, I believe, and I also capped the frame rate and the refresh rate to 50, which seemed to provide a smoother experience. And it looks like you could squeeze about 2.5 hours of gameplay out of this on the Steam Deck, and from a control perspective, everything worked exactly as I would expect without the need for me to make any modifications or use any community layouts to get a smooth experience. And again, I'm pretty early in the game, so I have no idea where the story is going to go in terms of what this cult is actually up to, but I know the atmosphere and the environments are alluring enough that I'm probably going to stick with this one and see it through to completion. So again, thank you to the Retro Rivals for the recommendation, and it's always nice to see another YouTuber who has an appreciation for horror stuff. Alright, and that's it for this video. Honestly, there were probably like another 50 or 60 recommendations that I'm still kind of working my way through and seeing what might make sense for a future video. But if you have any games that you think that I should check out and maybe I haven't played, or just, games that you're curious to see how well they play on the Steam Deck, please let me know in the comments below so I can work that into a future video. As always, thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch these. Really appreciate you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.